On today's show, the Padres make a move by signing pop star sensation Jose Iglesias to a deal. What that means for the Padres roster going forward, especially in regards to the May spring training battles going on right now. And then diving into the last 5 or so years of the Padres' efforts, or in some cases, futile efforts to add depth to this lineup and whether or not they're going to be able to do so in 2025. Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Thursday, March 6th, as always. I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter /X and Blue Sky at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO. Go check me out on there if you want questions answered on the show. You can also check out justbaseball.com and my recently relaunched podcast, Baseball versus the World, which I, of course, have to plug because we're going to be doing more of that. Follow that on Twitter and Instagram at Baseball versus World. Cool graphics. If you just like cool graphics, go check that out. It's going to be fun. Stay tuned, guys. Today's episode, guys, we are breaking down the Jose Iglesias signing, or basically what it could mean for the Padres going forward. And I don't think that this isn't, like many signings this offseason, with the exception of Nick Pivetta, there basically hasn't been like a needle mover major signing. Although in a lot of ways, I think this is probably the second biggest signing they've had this offseason. So going to talk about that and then talk about, similar to what I did a few weeks ago, talking about the history of the Padres kind of getting those last two spots in their rotation, whether or not they actually haven't gotten a lot of credit for producing pretty good pitching in the back of their rotation. We're going to talk about the back end of their lineup and whether or not they've gotten credit or they are rightfully condemned for being a team that's a little bit more superstar heavy, which is often, I think, the claim with them. So we'll get into that, guys. But let's start. Jose Iglesias. It was announced yesterday afternoon that the Padres would be signing my man to a minor league deal. Reading from MLB Trade Rumors, the Padres and free agent infielder Jose Iglesias are reportedly in agreement on a minor league contract. The Boras Corporation client will earn a $3 million base salary if he makes the roster and can take home another $1 million via incentives. That's a bit heavier base than the standard minor league pact, which seems reflective of Iglesias' 2024 season and perhaps strong interest on non-guaranteed deals of this nature. Iglesias, 35, enjoyed a tremendous comeback season in 2024 after not appearing in the majors at all in 2023. And that is true. He did have a major comeback season, and in more ways than one, right? I joked in the top of the podcast in the introduction that he became a pop star with his song OMG, which in some ways, my friend of mine actually messaged me saying like, hey, that's still us. We still get the OMG thing. He did that with the Mets. That's his home and whatnot, right? And I relate to that, and I agree in a lot of ways. And it's really cool, right? It was just such a fun storyline last year. And speaking of my other podcast, Baseball versus the World, we did actually mention this in our recent episode that I did. That it's just kind of wild, like watching that baseball has become, I think, a little bit more conducive to personality over these last few years. I have often genuinely believed that case zero per se was the Fernando Tatis Jr. 3-0 swing, because I think at that time he was so beloved that like everyone getting mad, or specifically the Rangers getting mad, everyone was in full-fledged support of Tatis, that it feels like the unwritten rule thing has been going away a little bit, and it feels like there's been more flair and personality in the game. And Jose Iglesias is a good example. The Mets are out here literally performing a concert on field with the players after a game because of this new song, because it's such a fun situation to be in, right? And I don't know if that would happen 20 years ago or if it was a different team. So shouts to him. In terms of as a player, last year he had a 137 WRC plus to go with his 337, 381, 448 slash line. That was by far the best he'd ever really done, with the exception of 2020, when in 39 games he had a 160 WRC plus for the Orioles. But overall, he's always been this player that's been a little bit more defensive than offensive, right? Like that's kind of been his specialty. But even still, this is a player that since 2013, he has not produced an F4 lower than 1. So to get a player like that for $3 million, that's not bad, right? Like I just don't see that as a big, like a big risk, I guess I could say, right? And I think that while there is a possibility he takes a step back, I did not notice, and I don't think a lot of people said, it feels like he was just really, really clutch last year. It feels like, yes, he took some steps forward and he had a decent job at the plate. He does have a good batting average. He'll put the ball in play. But his hard hit rate, average exit velocity, nothing really changed in a giant way in 2024, right? Like, he's still, yeah, he buffed it a little bit, right? Like, he was doing a little bit better. He's a guy who doesn't whiff a lot. But overall, as evidenced by his expected weighted on base mark of 314 compared to what he ended up with 362, he's probably not going to be a 337 hitter with a 381 on base who hits you for over 85 games, right? But what I do think he is he's a guy that's not going to strike out, and he's just going to be a well-rounded player that can run the bases a little bit, and he can play defense, and he'll serve as a backup, probably. Assuming he makes the team, which I think he will, given as MLB Trade Rumors just said, given the size of the contract, a backup to Xander Bogaerts. And that's why I like the move, because it's kind of cool that while the Padres do have a little bit of depth, they could move, theoretically, Jake Cronenworth if they had to over to shortstop. Losing Ha-Seong Kim made it that you need to have a little bit of a backup option in case anything happens to Xander Bogaerts, a player that has been injured a few times so far in his Padres tenure, and frankly, a player that we're going to talk about on tomorrow's show, by the way, we're starting to get a little bit scared, right? I've been thinking he's going to have a bounce back season, but there are a lot of vibes of like, this guy is just a little bit of a mess right now, so I think that Iglesias may play a little bit of a role in this team. I think this is a bigger deal than the Connor Joe, Jason Hayward, Martin Maldonado type of signings. I actually think Iglesias is going to play a decent amount of time, and if there is anything that they saw, right? If there is anything they saw in 2024 with the Mets that suggests maybe he's going to be a decent hitter. Maybe he's not going to be a 137 WRC plus guy, but maybe he's going to be okay. And fundamentally, the Padres just really seem to like guys that aren't striking out too much. That's just kind of the basis of their lineup, right? You don't really have anyone on this team that is a gargantuan strikeout rate guy. The only one I can think of, really, with the Padres that is a big strikeout guy was Tatis, but of yesteryear, right? And Tatis has been kind of, he's been good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to like mock the guy or anything, but if you look at last year, the player with the highest strikeout rate was Kyle Higashioka out of the players that mattered. You know what I mean? He had a 28.1 strikeout rate, and that's different because he's a catcher, and we weigh that a little bit differently. But in general, with this team, I mean, Fernando Tatis Jr. only had a 21.9% strikeout rate, hit 21 home runs in 100 something games. Jackson Merrill barely strikes out, doesn't walk as much, which isn't great, but he doesn't strike out. I think that's kind of their strategy here. I am wondering, right, because of this, is the going towards the approach of less strikeouts always going to be good? Not always, because technically, when you look at the landscape of the league, right, this is a league where if you're striking out a lot, if you're hitting for power, it's probably worth it, is what the calculus is, right? So I am wondering if they're going to be able to have enough guys that hit for power in this lineup. And this isn't Iglesias' fault. I'm just bringing it up. I'm just bringing up that it's an interesting note for the Padres going forward, how much pressure is going to be on guys like Manny Machado and Fernando Tatis Jr., players that, if I have to bet on someone, those are guys to bet on, but them supplying basically all the power on this team. Jackson Merrill, I understand he could do it too, right? He did hit for power last year, 24 home runs. But remember, it was a little bit unexpected. We'll see what happens in his sophomore season if he's still going to be able to keep up that power stroke. And then in general, outside of that, not too much power. You know what I mean? You lost Jurickson Profar. He hit 24 for you last year. Jake Cronenworth has a little bit of modicum of power, but not a ton. So we're going to have to see how that breaks down. But overall, I like the move. Gives you a decent backup. And I think that because of it, I think that the spring training, depending on what we see happen, over these last few weeks, unless Yuli Gurriel and Gavin Sheets really start impressing, which from what I see, I just don't feel like that's been a thing so far. It feels like, Tirso Ornelas, Jose Iglesias, Jason Hayward. I still think Eggy Rosario. I'm not concerned by the limited moments of shine, limited highlights that he's had so far in spring, and then maybe Connor Joe. I could see things changing down the line, don't get me wrong. I think that Iglesias maybe might not join the team immediately, right? Maybe this is a situation where they might have Gavin Sheets or another player, another infielder, maybe Tyler Wade for the beginning of the season, but overall, those are the last guys that I think are going to make the roster. That's what I see, right? And Tirso Ornelas has had a big spring. So we'll see. Overall, though, solid move. It's what you do when you're in the Padres situation, and it's not bad because, again, we don't know exactly what we're going to get out of Bogarts. And it's just nice to have a player who's competent, who's been a solid major leaguer, who's given positive F4, unlike Gurriel and unlike Gavin Sheets and some of the other guys that they've signed. He can at least be a little bit of a positive defensively. So we'll see. We'll see the overall guys. But, of course, speaking of filling out the rest of the lineup, we're talking about lineup depth for the last 2 segments of this podcast, guys. But before we do that, we need to take a second to hear from our sponsors. And just like that, everybody, we are back here on the Locked On Padres podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Remember to make us your first listen every day, because that's what we do out here. We like keeping you updated. We like being your first go-to source, man. Let's talk about it, though. Starting in 2019, I did this with the pitching, right? When I talked about the Padres' ability, whether it's been underrated, whether or not they've gotten production out of the back end of their rotation. And what I concluded on that episode was, yeah, I actually think the Padres have done a pretty good job, especially ever since they brought on Ruben Niebla, of producing decent players at the back end of that rotation, or unexpected good players in their rotation, right? That's why they've been like a little bit of a playoff contender, and even at times, before they went scoreless for 24 innings, a World Series contender. Let's start with 2019, because also I call that the beginning of when Padres really got fascinating. I know Hosmer was a big deal, but there have been small market teams that have made pushes for okay players and spent a lot before. This was like, oh my God, you got like a Hall of Famer? Like, this is pretty nuts that he chose the Padres. So I chose 2019. So in terms of 2019, the players that I feel like were the bench sort of options, the not even bench options necessarily, but just guys who are going to help supplement the star power from this team, right? That was in 2019, Ian Kinsler, Francisco Mejia, Franmil Reyes / Hunter Renfroe, Manuel Margot, and maybe a little Greg Garcia, right? Maybe just a little bit of Greg Garcia. That year was weird. It was a weird year, because those guys, you saw Franmil Reyes get traded. But Franmil Reyes, when he was with the Padres, was actually kind of okay. Like, he wasn't that bad. You know, he actually hit a decent amount. The problem with him is that he was a defensive liability, and that's kind of what kept him out of MLB in general and why he kind of fell off. But in that 2019 season, 111 WRC plus, right? Like, he was okay. He was producing. And the year before that for the Padres, hit a 129. He hit for power. He had 37 home runs in total in 2019. Like, he was okay. He wasn't incredible, and I think that they made that trade because they wanted to move things around. The team wasn't competitive, but I heard he was actually like a decent clubhouse guy too. Ian Kinsler, I feel like the less said about Ian Kinsler, the better. I feel like Ian Kinsler was, for a bunch of reasons, just not a very loved player in San Diego, right? Like, he came there at the wrong time, and it seems like he was taking opportunities in that lineup from some other players that people would have preferred, right? And he was dreadful. 646 OPS his final season in Major League Baseball. He was worth negative WAR, just not very good. It was one of those like desperate veteran moments, right? It happens. It happens for every team. But that is one of the themes with the Padres, or at least one of the allegations, one of the trends that can occasionally pop up, is that they are not good at getting the last bit of juice out of these like veteran name players, right? And we're going to talk about some of those. And what I mean is that there are players who have like final going out party seasons, right? For lack of a better term. And the Padres tend to sign those guys the year after they had that last hurrah of a season, right? And we're going to talk about them, but that's one of the issues. And I think Ian Kinsler was one of those, and he just did not produce all that much. Greg Garcia was not a very good player. He was a good guy who could walk, but he was kind of like an Ender Enciarte type of player where like, yeah, he was walking a decent amount, but he just had like no slug whatsoever. So it kind of didn't matter, right? Like, this just was not very good. And it's not like he did that much around the field. And then you have Hunter Renfroe, who was at times, I've talked about many times that when he had that game against the Rockies, when he just hit like 3 home runs in a game, or no, when he hit the walk-off, I believe, against the Dodgers in that 2019 season, he was okay. 778 OPS. He had his moments. Hunter Renfroe, at one point in time, I was like kind of convinced that he could be a guy. And by the way, Hunter Renfroe ended up being a little tiny bit of a guy going forward, right? He had a moment with the Boston Red Sox in 2021 where he played pretty good defense and he mashed 31 home runs. He was nearly a 3-win player, right? And with the Padres, 1.8 win player. In 2018, 2019, he was 1.7. But I think overall that Padres lineup, well, I would definitely think that there's a world in which Hunter Renfroe, like if you could take that 2019 Hunter Renfroe, right, where he hit 33 home runs and whatnot, and you plugged him into this lineup instead of Tirso or Nellis, or at least he was, I don't know what Tirso is going to be, but that would have some value, especially if he had the defensive capabilities that he showed in Boston, right? In that 1 year when he hit 31 bombs and played really good defense, like that would have had some value. So Hunter Renfroe, pretty good. Franmil Reyes, pretty good. I don't know which one to call like more of lineup depth. It was okay. The problem though is just that fundamentally the rest of the team was just not there, right? So I'm not hating on the rest of these guys necessarily. This was still a season in which the team was just overall not very good. And Manuel Margot, last player, would have some moments for the Tampa Bay Rays. Good defensive player, kind of what we might hope. Those Jason Hayward could pull off, right? Not a good offensive player, but good defense. And he was eventually traded in the Emilio Pagan trade, which was kind of whatever. I mean, it ended up killing them later on, but their lack of outfield depth did hurt them for a few years after that. And Emilio Pagan was capable of throwing high heat through strikeouts, but gave up way too many home runs. That was back when the Rays still had the "don't trade with them because they know things" label, which the Padres would then later destroy, of course. They would deconstruct it with the amount of trades we won against them. But that is it for 2019. In terms of 2020, this was a weird year. As everybody knows, this is the coming out party for the entire Padres as an organization in a lot of ways. You have Tatis, you have Manny Machado, and Will Myers, I'm counting as not a star, but I'm counting as, well, you signed him to be that way, right? And he did have some moments with the Padres, so I'm not counting him as part of this, but in general, this was kind of when a lot of people showed up. In 2020, you got a lot of production from some lineup players, right? And I think that this is what I'm talking about with this Padres team, that when it comes to their ability, everybody thinks that the Padres have this lineup that is just not deep. And that is sometimes true. But in my opinion, that is a product of what they're surrounded by. Whether intentionally or not, people are like, well, how are you going to compete with the Dodgers? You're starting, Will Myers every day. And I'm like, well, yeah, but look at the other teams in baseball. Because the Reds back then had like a huge lineup depth? Oh, because the Cubs had big lineup depth? Oh, because whoever it is, right? Brewers actually did have good depth. But you get my point, right? The Marlins, all these teams. And I'm like, the Padres, I think, do a little bit better job than people realize. And 2020 was the first year for that, in my opinion. In 2020 was Trent Grisham, Jake Cronenworth. Tommy Pham was a trade. I don't really count him because at that time, Tommy Pham was like a star-ish player. Not a star, but like he was this is an anchor for your offense, right? So I'm not counting him, even though it was a trade and it wasn't necessarily like a big-time name player. I just think heading into that year with the Padres in 2020, he was coming off a 3.5 win season. Before that, 3.6. Before that, 5.8. So that's like you were bringing in a guy. And with the Padres, he wasn't very good. And he wasn't very good the year after, although he started off good. And then he redeemed himself a little bit later down the line with various other teams. But aside from Tommy Pham, it was Trent Grisham. The breakout of Trent Grisham needs to be studied. He was amazing that year, and it was a trade that they made. And at that moment, it was good, right? Like, it was really, really good. So, plus for the Padres at this point, 2020, he had a 122 WRC plus. He hit 10 home runs. He stole 10 bases. He was just really, really solid. 352 on base. He played great defense. He was a 2.4 win player in just 59 games. Grisham was an A+. But then, even more importantly, because he's still good to this day, unlike Trent Grisham, who becomes a little bit of a negative when we talk about him in future years, but you then have Jake Cronenworth, who comes out, and again, this is what's so like amazing about baseball, is that Jake Cronenworth was a guy that just balled out in spring training. He did. I remember talking about him on this show where I was like, guy looks good. The swing looks crisp. I don't know what that means all the time. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scout. You'd have to go follow some of my Baseball America friends. But in general, he just looked solid, and he was just ripping the ball, getting some singles, some doubles, putting together productive at-bats. So then Jorge Mateo is announced that he's sick, I believe, with COVID. And then Jake Cronenworth comes in, and the rest is history. Jake Cronenworth became one of the building blocks for the Padres. Sometimes he was viewed in a way, I think, by the Padres, evidenced by the extension, as a player that was a building block, but maybe you shouldn't have been treating him that way. But bottom line is that year, 126 WRC plus. He had a weighted on base of 356. This guy was ripping the ball all the time. He was a freak, and he actually played really good defense across the diamond too. And then same thing happened in 2021. So he does get credit, and in general, not going to bring up him up again, the way I'm going to bring up Trent Grisham, I think he was absolutely a hit. One of those big hits that the Padres have when it came to building out lineup depth. Last two, I should say, last three. Mitch Moreland, Ty France, and Austin Nola. Mitch Moreland was a bust. It was just, look, I don't hate it. It's not a move that's worth hating because bottom line is that team, I think that teams were like, anything can really happen. It's a short season. Like, we don't have to worry. You know what I mean? Like, so I think people were going for it. But in that 2020 season, he had a 136 WRC plus in total. But man, he did not produce with the Padres. And it felt like he kind of went out of the way immediately. A good example of sometimes the trend of AJ Preller, he does come sometimes seize on guys that look a little bit better at that moment. And then not necessarily afterwards. He went from an 1177, 1.177 OPS to a 609 OPS with the Padres. He was a miss. And then lastly, Austin Nola. I think this was another example of, you know what? It's a short season. Let's just go for it. Like, we might be able to get a World Series title. Who knows who's going to be able to win. In 2020, he was okay, right? With two teams, he had an 825 OPS. With the Padres, 705 though, right? 903 with the Mariners and then 705 with the Padres. So not so great there, but all in all. Oh, and then last one, Ty France. Yeah. That was an L by the Padres. He was hitting when he actually was up and unfortunately was involved in that Austin Nola trade. But a big part of that was because of the aforementioned failures from the rest of the catchers. One of them that I forgot to mention, by the way, Francisco Mejia. God, do you guys remember the Francisco Mejia versus, who was it? Austin Hedges debate? And Francisco Mejia, every time they'd bring him up, although I didn't like how inconsistently they brought him up, he could just never hit. So yeah, all in all, so far through the Padres, you have misses with Ian Kinsler, Francisco Mejia, Manuel Margot, Greg Garcia, Mitch Moreland, Tommy Pham. Basically, I'll call that a miss. I know he got hurt in 2020, but he was also bad the next year. And then Austin Nola, a miss too, right? And then in terms of the hits, you did have some though, right? You did have some. You had Trent Grisham, you had Jake Cronenworth, and you had Ty France. Even though you ended up trading Ty France, so that kind of becomes a moot point. But what about the years after? Let's talk about those guys, because it does get better later, and it might be the sign of why we should be optimistic heading into this next season for the Padres. But first, got to take a second to talk about one of our sponsors that's very chewy and very yummy. That's right, everybody. Today, we got to talk about our friends over at... What do you think it is? It's wonderful Pistachios, ladies and gentlemen. We love wonderful pistachios so much here on Locked On Padres because it is a snack that's both nutritious and delicious. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. They have no shells, wonderful pistachios. They've got, a bunch of different flavors and the satisfying crack. You love it, man. I know I like it. Sometimes I just whip them things out and I get in the mood. You know what I mean? When I'm doing work and whatnot, it feels great. It's very, very good. So what are you waiting for, everybody? Especially as someone myself has been losing weight, trying to curtail his sweet tooth a little bit. Get some wonderful pistachios, guys. Get snackin and get crackin with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Go check it out. And just like that, everybody, we are back here on Locked On Padres podcast, thriving and vibing as always. Let's continue reviewing AJ Preller and the Padres' ability to put together a more complete lineup. Because then, after 2020, where we had our big hits, Trent Grisham and Jake Cronenworth, and Ty France until he traded him, it's 2021. And this was tough, guys, let me tell you. Jake Marisnick, Adam Frazier, Ha-Seong Kim a little bit, but he was a signing, a high-profile signing, I should call it. Victor Caratini and Luis Campuzano as the players that I identified as, guys that you were hoping fill out the rest of your lineup. And this is basically L's across the board for the most part, right? Adam Frazier, again, I just talked about Mitch Moreland. This is something that Preller does sometimes. You kind of seize on the guy who's doing really good in that moment, and Adam Frazier never showed. At least with Mitch Moreland, you could say, you know what? What if this guy's just getting really hot for another 30 games? You know what I mean? What if he's just going to be able to do that? Adam Frazier was a full season sort of thing. And you went and got him. And don't get me wrong, he was having a good season by the time the Padres got him in that 2021 season. And he was an all-star. He had the really cool jacket at the all-star game. But in general, with the Padres, when they traded for him, he had let me see if I could put this together here. He had a 779, or I'm sorry, an 836 OPS with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He was hitting 324 with a 388 on base. What happened after that? 662 OPS. There wasn't any sign that things had changed. So that was a bad move by AJ Preller. Not saying that what they gave up ended up being, world beating. Jack Sawinski has had some moments as a player, don't get me wrong. But overall, not like you're dying after that one, right? But I think what we did see is this is following in the trend of Preller's mistakes. And then what else did they do? Kind of surprisingly, Adam Frazier was like the only main move that they made. And yeah, he was terrible. Like, he just didn't hit with the Padres. Like, he was just a total bust with the Padres, as I mentioned with the OPS. Jake Marisnick, that was, in my opinion, a little bit of a concession move. I think they were like, we need to get a guy that can field because we have some problems with the depth on this team. And it was desperate, and he was not very good. We don't really need to talk about that. He didn't play too much, but was not a move that helped the Padres. And famously, the Padres 2021 team was a collapse, and it was really rough to watch. Then you had Ha-Seong Kim. This is an interesting one. This is a very interesting one because on the one hand, he could not hit that first year, right? But he was still brought in to potentially be a decent player, especially for those times when Tatis was hurt. And this is back when Tatis was playing shortstop. And while he did only have a 71 WRC+, he did at least flash the leather a little bit. But in general, did not produce what you would have wanted that first year. 0.4 wins above replacement in 117 games is quite bad. The offense was just atrocious. You know what I mean? But again, I think part of that was because he was forced into playing time when he wasn't quite ready, right? So Ha-Seong Kim, that year was a miss. We love you, Kimmy, but that year was not very good. Victor Caratini. I think that Victor Caratini was a fine player as long as you weren't expecting him to do what he had to do, which is field all the time because Austin Nola kept getting injured, right? In 116 games, he had an OPS of 632. He had a couple walk-offs, one against the Reds that I remember very much. Shout out Don Arcila's call. But Victor Caratini is best viewed as a backup catcher. So this one's not as much an L as much as it's just like, wow, he could not hold down the catching position, right? He's better as a backup, came involved in the Yu Darvish trade. And then lastly, Luis Campusano, it's worth talking about him only in the sense that this guy was just handled horribly. I've talked about this many times on this show that I don't understand why you're bringing him in for just 11 games for him to hit below 100. Like, you put him in a horrible position, in my opinion. So that was less about the lineup depth and versus just how you executed it. Although maybe one could say they're one and the same. But then 2022 came along. And 2022, in my opinion, when you look back at it, guys, the 2022 Padres were not an incredible team, right? They were a little bit clutch, actually, in a lot of ways, right? Like, they came through when it mattered. And in general, though, that's not because I think they had, like, incredible players. In terms of building out the lineup, 2022 was actually kind of an L. I'm not counting Juan Soto because that was obviously, like, that's a superstar player. That's not, you added him, but that is not adding depth. That is adding a star. But in terms of the guys that I looked at, Luke Voigt, Jorge Alfaro, Brandon Drury, Josh Bell, Ha-Seong Kim, I think this year counts because he was a big part of the reason the Padres made the playoffs. Jurickson Profar, Jose Azocar, Robinson Cano, right? Robinson Cano, don't need to talk about him, a mess. He played 11 games. That was just, oh my God, what are they doing? They really need Tatis back, right? We were starting to feel it around this time. We were like, oh my God, we desperately need them. Then Luke Voigt, he had his moments, 733 OPS, right? He slugged 416. He had a few bunch of home runs, 13. He was a vibe. I liked when he did the beer chug thing with water. That was kind of fun. But overall, it didn't work, right? It just was not that effective of a player. Will Myers actually was, kind of on the way out. But 713 OPS, he didn't produce nearly that much. But in terms of the rest of the players, oh no, they still didn't. We still are getting bad seasons from Trent Grisham. He hit 184 this year. Ends up being a mess in the playoffs that, in my opinion, tainted him. Like, I'll never forget that period of the playoffs when he's bunting with our season on the line. Like, it was just ridiculous. Ha-Seong Kim, though, great season. He buffs his OPS up to 708, but overall, positive WRC plus and plays gold glove level defense. He was great. But outside that, man, guys, there's a lot of L's here. Jorge Alfaro, that was just desperation, right? They were not confident in Luis Campusano, and they bring in this guy. And I know what you're thinking. Well, he was great. No, he wasn't a very good player. He just had 6 walk-off moments. And don't get me wrong, that's great, but that is different than you found a good talent. Does that make sense? It's like he's a Padres legend, but like there's a world in which another player just has 6 walk-offs, and it's not because they were a great player, but they just happened to come through in those 6 instances. It was great. Broke records for the Padres. He's a vibe, but all in all, not a huge W for the Padres. Josh Bell, by the way, Josh Bell and Brandon Drury, both not very good for this team. 724 OPS for my guy Brandon Drury, 587 for Josh Bell. I don't know what happened to those guys, because those guys actually did produce a little bit before they were traded to the Padres. This wasn't necessarily Preller bought high on these guys, maybe Drury a little bit, but they did not help out. The lineup depth was not very good that year, right? But they did have a little bit of vibes in Jurickson Profar and one Sir Ha-Seong Kim and a tiny bit of Luke Voigt. But Ha-Seong Kim was mostly decent bat, great defense, but that still counts, right? This is still them accumulating some depth. And then Jurickson Profar had a pretty solid season, right? 723. He produced the most wins above replacement of his career. Like really, really good stuff. And I was excited about it. Very, very excited about it. And then we had 2023, in which there wasn't supposed to be necessarily a giant need for lineup depth because you added Xander Bogaerts, but behind him, it was not good outside of one Sir Ha-Seong Kim in terms of the rest of your lineup producing. 2023, less said the better, but you had a couple moments, right? You had a couple. And that came in the form of Gary Sanchez. Gary Sanchez and Luis Campusano finally giving Campusano some time. You sent Austin Nola packing, but Luis Campusano did produce a above average WRC plus. And Gary Sanchez, 792 OPS. They actually signed him and it just worked. I don't think the Padres knew that was going to happen. Nobody knew that was going to happen. Ends up going to the Brewers the next year. He was a disaster. I don't know what happened with Gary, but the guy drove in 46 runs in 72 games. Like he was on a freaking stretch. I can't believe that worked. And then in terms of Luis Campusano, we've talked about him a lot. But outside that, you basically have not much. This is the Matt Carpenter year. That was a big miss for the team. Nelson Cruz, that was a big miss for the team. Garrett Cooper and G-Man Choi at the deadline. Both of them didn't produce. Garrett Cooper a little bit more so than G-Man Choi, who had as many hits as I did, basically, for the Padres that year. They were supposed to be like a platoon. They could lefty-righty split, but that team was cursed from the beginning. But overall, you basically only have Gary Sanchez. That was the big one. Rougned Odor, not very good. Matthew Batten had more WAR than Garrett Cooper and G-Man Choi combined. It was bad, man. It was bad. Matthew Batten maybe should have gotten some more opportunities, but overall, again, lineup depth was a problem with this team in 2023. And then you have 2024, which was masterful, right? 2024, easily the best year that the Padres have ever had when it comes to landing those players in the back end of your lineup that are going to produce and supplement your stars. And that, of course, came technically with Jackson Merrill. He's not a role player, he's a top-level prospect, but even still, he was viewed heading into last year as like a guy that hopefully can make this lineup a little bit better and replace Trent Grisham, who's been a disaster that I didn't even want to talk about anymore as we recount all of this and whatnot. But you have Jackson Merrill, and then you hit on literally every other player. The worst one being Luis Arraez. I say worst, by the way, and I mean worse like as a compliment. This is a guy who had a torn thumb, basically. He didn't have a thumb, and he still was able to produce as an above average at bat, right? 744 OPS with the Padres, 106 WRC plus with them. He at least still produced, and that's better than all the other guys that the Padres have been that we've been talking about in this episode. And then you had W's across the board. You had a W in Jurickson Profar like you'd not believe. 4.3 win season. Absolutely ridiculous. He was the second best player on the team, basically, in totality for the season. And you got him for $1 million. No one's ever seen anything like it. It's pretty unprecedented. I don't think the Padres saw it coming because they signed him late. But nonetheless, you did hit there. And then you hit with Donovan Solano big time. And then in the trade of Juan Soto, you got back Kyle Higashioka, and you even brought in David Peralta, who was pretty good too. All of these guys, this was the reason the Padres hit 93 wins. This is not a coincidence that the Padres had their best season because they got some decent contributions from the back end of their lineup. Obviously, there's a world in which Fernando Tatis Jr. goes out as an 8-win player this year, and if they just have meh, right, then they'll make the playoffs, right? He is capable of that. We've seen that before. But all in all, it's not a coincidence, guys. It's not, right? Donovan Solano, 117 WRC plus player. This stuff adds up. And if they're able to do that with this year's crop of guys, right, that could be special. But let me tell you, 2025 does have some moments and trends for previous players that the Padres have fallen for that have not produced as much, either fallen for or had no choice to get, whatever you want to call it, right? Because they have, in my opinion, this year, in terms of lineup depth, as of right now, what I'm expecting, right, who's going to help boost the depth of the team, Connor Joe, Jason Hayward, Jose Iglesias, Eggy Rosario, and Tirso and Ellis. That's who I'm feeling. And all in all, there are some similarities here. You got a little bit of the, is this a washed up vet, Jason Hayward type of vibe. Same thing for Connor Joe. You've got Tirso and Ellis, right? Like, is he going to be this prospect guy that can come through? I don't know. Connor Joe, we just had to sign somebody, right? The way that they did with, say, Luke Voigt, right? And I know they're different positions. And then lastly, right, Jose Iglesias. Does he fit a little bit of that Adam Frazier, Matt Carpenter model where it's like these guys had career years and you're hoping that they can do it again? I don't know. Now, here's the thing. It changes, right? The circumstances are different. This can't be judged in a vacuum. When the Padres were messing up before with lineup depth, they had a lot more prospects. They had a lot more of a farm system, right? Nowadays, I'm like, okay, sign Jose Iglesias. It can't hurt. It can't hurt. You don't really have anybody else. What are you going to do? Mason McCoy? Right? So, no offense to Mason McCoy. He actually had a couple moments last year. But that's what I'm feeling. All in all, the Padres have had some good breakouts. But in terms of L's, Francisco Mejia, Ian Kinsler, Greg Garcia, Mitch Moreland, Tommy Pham, Austin Nola, Jake Marisnick, Adam Frazier, Victor Carrot, not Victor Carrot. I'm going to give him the pass because it was just because the other guy was hurt, Austin Nola. Handling Luis Campuzano poorly. We're at 10 already. Luke Voigt, fine, right? Fine. Whatever, fine. Jorge Alfaro, Brandon Drury, Josh Bell for sure. Jose Azocar, Robinson Cano, Matt Carpenter, not Gary Sanchez, Matt Carpenter, Nelson Cruz, G-Man Choi, Garrett Cooper, Brunette Odor, right? Like, it's been a little bit, like, when they hit, they hit. They've had a couple insane hits with Jurickson Profar, Jackson Merrill, Donovan Solano, Kyle Higashioka. They've had some. But all in all, this has been a problem for the Padres, is putting together the supporting cast. And while I do have some confidence in like a Tirso and Ellis, just because I like that we've never seen anything from him before. He's currently 6th in National League Rookie of the Year betting, by the way. Like, it does feel like, man, we got to get something. The guys that you have to hope for the most are Eggy Rosario and Tirso and Ellis, if those guys can be good. The other guys, you're just signing some veterans in. Man, we haven't always been good at that, at judging when the time is up, right? Did Jose Iglesias just have one more fun dream season? Or was it the sign of something else to come? I'm doubtful. And I think that the Padres' recent history is exactly why you should be doubtful too. That doesn't mean they can't be good, but it is something to keep an eye on for this season and is a trend that needs to be talked about with the Padres especially. Are they a little bit too top heavy? I don't know. But with that all being said, everybody, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Ranting Padres Rambling podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow the show and myself on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, as well as Blue Sky. Send me some questions. We are tomorrow going to be talking about Xander Bogaerts and Eric Hosmer, because why not? Fun Friday. I like making Fridays fun. And tomorrow we're going to talk about whether or not Xander Bogaerts is the new Eric Hosmer, among other things. So stay tuned for that one, guys. But until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful, my Friar Faithful homies. Take care.